50% of the room, right? So we already know that mergers and acquisitions, anyone's been through it, it's quite a disruptive process. And it has a significant impact on people, our customers, our organisation, the way we blend all the businesses together. And one of the things about realising value is it seldom happens at the at the front end of the deal. It happens as we go through the deal and we integrate and we come out the other end of it. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. I want to bring you up to speed a little bit with what is going on. There's a lot of activity in the mergers and acquisitions market. And I guess we all think about mergers and acquisitions being during the boom periods, and then the GFC hit and everything stopped. But actually the opposite is true. Yes, there were a couple of years of some pulling back of some capital injections and some opportunities that were possibly shelved at that stage. But if we look back towards 2012, 2013 and in the early part of 2014, we can see that actually the appetite for mergers and acquisitions is well and truly back on the radar screen. Particularly here in Asia. Asia represents about 1/3 of those deals. And so we're certainly seeing an environment where there's a lot more local entry deals, so consolidation of market. And obviously one of the things we've seen in the LSP space is that Asia presents an opportunity for that as deal values are low, they are increasingly changing. We've seen average deal values slightly increase. So there's certainly been more equity back in the markets since 2010 when most of that equity got sucked out. It's starting to return. And once again, Asia's playing a much, much heavier role in that counterbalance of that. The Americas, for a dollar value, always very strong. That's influenced in many ways by infrastructure deals, so railways, as an example. And why infrastructure is important in that deal value is that infrastructure multiples tend to be looked at a little bit differently from the VC companies compared to perhaps an operating business where there's an element of more risk. It's easier to invest in a railway than to build a whole new railway, for example. But we're certainly seeing the increase in equity valuations leading to higher value deals. So Asia today represents about an average deal of $50 million, which is quite large for the Asian economy. And it's showing some maturity in that. So M&As are back on the agenda. But they don't always achieve what we want them to achieve. And I think we can all look back and probably talk about companies we've come across as customers or experienced, or suppliers of ours, where all the promises that they came out and told us we're going to do these wonderful things. I see you smiling, Leon, right? You've been through it before. We don't quite get the value we thought we were going to get, so now we have to reshape how we handle that, or more importantly, we're going to take a bit more time about how we actually integrate, ensuring that we do capture what value's left. Particularly difficult in emerging markets. You've all heard this concept of parallel businesses, where someone sells you a particular product and all of a sudden, or a particular business, and all of a sudden you find that actually out the back door, there is a company that suddenly popped up and suddenly looks the same, and that's where all the customers have gravitated to. I worked with an organisation about 3-4 years ago who were in the express logistics business. We could never kind of work out why we didn't get all the value in some markets, so we went and had a closer look at some markets. We actually found that even in one of the depots, there was a competitor organisation where they were running trucks and linehaul express services out of the same depot that we believed we had purchased, and the two companies were running side by side. Ironically, both were the same owner, both the same manager, and due diligence probably would have helped us address that had we taken time to slow down to the process. So we don't always achieve our buyers' objectives. And part of the reason for that comes down to where the pitfalls are. So can I sort of show of hands of those people again who have been through an acquisition? Okay. Put them nice and high. I would like you people with the hands up just to grab a circle with each of the people around you and take the lead on that because you've been through it. I want you to think about your experience, and I want you to come back to me in a couple of minutes' time and make the top 3 pitfalls that you believe have existed in that. So hands up again. Quick group. If you're not on a table with the chairs one, go and jump on a table. Leon, you're one. Oscar, you're the other. Come on, don't be shy. 2 minutes to tell me what the top 3 pitfalls are. At some point we'll get the right slide back up again. So what are the pitfalls that you experience when you do a merger and acquisition? Everyone's been here, we all hear the stories. Give me the top 3.
for the version.
It's not, it's a new word today. Parallel group, right? Also known as well, markets. So what are the top 3 pitfalls? What are the things that can go wrong? And then I'll tell you while you're doing that, at McKinsey, the consulting house, did a survey late last year on what they thought the top 3 were, and they did a survey of about 1,500 deals all around the world. What can possibly go wrong? What can possibly go wrong? What are the common things that we trip over? You've got some experience with
So basically, you cannot maximize the.
Okay, another minute. Okay, we all got some points. So they don't always achieve the buyer's objectives. Okay. I'll come down to your group. Oscar, what did you come up with as the top 3 pitfalls for merger or acquisition?
Okay, the number 1 is definitely around people. So you might lose people in the whole process. You need to build a new culture. Half of the people felt bought over, and the other one feels as the buyer. There will be power play around positions, so that's everything around
Cultural alignment.
Yeah. System integration was definitely number 2 here in the team as well. Okay, and there is a danger that you get too inward focused and lose sight of your customer. So everyone is busy.
Too much time trying to put the back end together, and actually the customer's already involved.
Excellent.
Okay. What else group down here? What did we come up with? There's 3 here. Oscar's just going to try and bring the microphone over. What do we identify here? Someone?
Something similar. Is it working?
Yep.
So something similar where we also talked about people, mainly the fact that people are, let's say, very specialized for that company that is purchased, where when they are taken over, they might not feel comfortable with the whole organization and leave, where you lose all the knowledge.
He goes out the front door with stuff.
You don't have the marketing skills that they had, for example. So yeah, the other one was also people where the cultures might not necessarily align, which is something similar as well.
So I think the world should be red, and the person I've just bought thinks it should be blue, and we can't meet in the middle somewhere.
Correct.
What about this group over here? Now you've been part of a big change in your organisation.
I went through 2, so that's why I think one of the area we're looking at, I think the team shares, they usually one size fits all, means that the acquirer will say that I have this template, I try to apply to this new organization, and we fall flat because the organization might be in different market space and also kind of different kind of way of working. So maybe that also applies to system, because you try to use your own system, maybe the system is too expensive for certain market, for example. Second part is the culture misfit. I think definitely, buying a company just a start, how to integrate them and try to align with our culture, with our people is one of the biggest area that I've seen. In fact, service industry like logistics is about service of people. So you lose all the people, actually you lose all the business. The business go with it. Yeah, and then also apply the leadership. How do you align the leadership? New leadership was the one that is exited. The last one basically is a misfit of the customers. So maybe for customer, the guy that buy over the acquiring company buy over a company, the customer of those company might not actually be able to fit into the new entities. The way they work, their style of working, and also maybe the kind of margin they're looking at.
So they see value and actually get inside and realize.
Yeah, and definitely in the process of acquisition, or the integration, a lot of time you got poached because of uncertainty. So
disruption to the business.
Yep.
Buying off the game.
Yep.
Does your team have any additions?
Okay, I think potentially the pitfalls could be in the form of integrating the business lines and the functions. So because you could, company A would have certain service portfolios, company B would have certain service portfolios. Integrating these is will be very challenging, and integrating these and communicating to the customers that okay, these are not two different companies anymore, but this is one single company. I think that is probably the big challenge, because once a customer gets confused, then you're going to lose the customer. Also, like the other team said, of course, the skills profiling is a very important part of the entire exercise. Because if you don't match the skills of company A with company B, and if company B employees feel that no, we are superior and they are superior, if you don't profile and have a good benchmark, then you're going to lose people. And of course,
lose the IP and it's walked out the door forever.
Yeah. So and now with all this information age, I think one more pitfall would be in terms of how well you integrate the technology, the communication systems and the information systems. If you don't do it right, then it's probably like a Y2K.
So making sure the business fits into the right engagement point in the business.
Yeah.
Making sure we keep that IP in terms of human capital, and making sure we get the process aligned, particularly from systems perspective. So no disruption. I'm just going to fire the microphone over the last table here and see if there's anything to add over here from your group, or have you pretty much nailed the same points?
Yeah, it's kind of the same. I think it's like the people management that comes. If you lost any personnel, and it's like kind of a big pitfall. And other one for my accountants is like the hidden liabilities behind the M&A. Sometimes you just can't see it.
Have we really scratched the surface of what they've told us, and we've started to question the real value? Well, first of all, give yourselves a big round of applause. You're exactly on the mark. I mean, what McKinsey's found was that actually 2/3 of the organisations they surveyed didn't get the basics right. And what they identified was the basics were the similar things that you were talking about, right? They didn't plan and execute a thoroughly well thought out integration plan. So resulted in the integration being rushed, being flawed, which is what you're talking about with those not getting to the skeletons in the closet. And they didn't think about how they were going to apply that process prior to actually owning the organisation. Part of that came back to not putting the right leadership in place to drive that. The skills needed to drive an integration are sometimes very different to the skills required to make a business successful. And so there needed to be a team that had a balance of the skills. And then the third piece was the one about the people which you're talking about. They didn't actually hone in on the skills required to actually make the value realised. Right? So people, once again, people. And now the interesting thing about that was all those things there feature up front. So they're not things you can do if you've already bought the company. Because by that stage, you've already started to erode the value. So they happen right at the very start of the process. And interestingly enough, many parts of due diligence don't factor in those three things. So there's no doubt about it that success requires a much deeper and stronger integration process that's intense, and it has a select set of skills required to do that job. And as I say, that's a different skill than what necessarily is to run the business. You need an integration approach that's flexible, because those of you that have been through a merger before, either as the acquirer or as the person being bought, nothing ever goes to plan, does it? And so we need to be nimble in our strategy around that. And of course the bottom line there is also we need to take a much more rigid approach, an analyst, almost viewpoint, helicopter view, looking down at the data and taking away the emotion as part of that integration process. Because you can miss things. And a classic example, there was a transport business I worked with about 4.5, 5 years ago, who bought an Asian business, and inside that business they bought a China domestic courier business that allegedly had 17 branches and 17 operations and 17 sets of people and 17 separate entities, and yet only one of those had an actual authorised business licence. So effectively they're only running one company, and these other 16 branches were sort of these pop-up sheds that really weren't operating in any form of compliance. Now that's okay if you can sort of keep going as they've always gone, but when you're a publicly listed company and you've acquired them, it's a big problem. Right? And you've got to go back and unwind that. Unfortunately, in that case, they didn't find out until a year later when someone come knocking asking for the business license. So, reasonably risky profile for your shareholders. So, we've talked about the people. The common theme amongst all of you was this people, the importance of people. And it really is one of the most important, but also one of the most complex parts of an acquisition. That graph you're looking at, it's probably a little bit hard to read from back here, but the slides are available from the organisers online. If you work from the top to the bottom, that's the percentage of companies that actually realised value in those categories. So sure, down the bottom, 35% last year said they actually met the profitability expectations. They got a favourable result. They thought they were going to make $100, they made 35, but it was better than they thought, so we're okay. Right? But as you start to climb up, yep, they met their favourable cash flow objectives, they sort of had their employees understanding what the direction, but they're low numbers, because what that number says, if I could read my graph properly, is 30% of the people who are in the acquired business actually really understood the direction they're going. So flip that around, 70% don't know where we're heading. And as you climb up through that, you get more and more of the people issues. Quality, customer service, engagement, morale, ultimately speed to market. 20% of people said actually we were way too slow to get to market with the combined entity. And that eroded the value by which we were purchasing. So an acquisition is not just about the intellectual parts of it, the capital transaction, it's actually about the minds. It's about the people, it's about bringing them on that journey. And that doesn't happen after you've told them their business card's going to change from blue to red, or vice versa. It happens prior to that process. It's an important part of the process. And you've got to make an investment decision about how to engage those people that may be, as you talked about before, a little bit reluctant, uncertain. Do I have a job? What's it going to look like? All those things. They're the people you've got to win the hearts of. So the heart of the matter really comes back to people. And interesting enough in this regards is that the people aspect of the deal today, when you talk to M&A experts, will all tell you that people are the most critical part of it. You've got to get that piece right. If you go to Deloitte's, if you go to Capgemini, PwC, who provide some of the research material for this, you'll all see the people part of the things that are really high on their agenda. The interesting part about it is when that cascades to the customer, normally it's the people piece sitting at the end of the process and it's not up front as part of the integration plan. So the real challenge for organisations that are entering that M&A market is how to reposition that prior to the start of the process. And that's normally, I mean, we've all been in companies, right? You're normally somewhere down the path before knowing. The board's already made the decision to buy the company, but nowhere does that people piece factored. It's an afterthought. So how do you do that? That's a little bit more complex. It starts with this question of, I think I can find it in a moment. Thank you. It starts with that. Where's HR? I work on about half a dozen to 10 sort of teams a year in this region particularly about M&A. So it's good that they're bringing in someone who knows a bit about people. That's a good sign. But often I'm the only person in the room at the start of the integration process that has an HR hat on. And I'm the outsider. And so we raise the question, so well, where's HR? Where's your HR director? Where's their counterpart to work with? Oh, they'll join the process after we've done the deal. We need to make sure we're going to do the deal first before we can turn it over to HR. Or other excuses I've heard. There's no point in getting HR involved. We haven't bought the company yet. HR needs to be part of your due diligence team. I'm not going to cover the pieces on the far left of the slide, but effectively there are some certain characteristics you're looking for as in the construction of your due diligence teams. And HR has a very, very fundamental role to play in that. It's the only way you can re-engage the agenda item of where you actually put your diligence around your people is to have them crafting that strategy. And as the statement says, it's absolutely critical if you want to capture the unrealised benefit. So, what do we do? Well, here's a couple of quick pointers for you. And I may have to stretch on that 20 minutes, so we'll all sort of start for 5 minutes after. But the first thing is we've got to take the lead in the acquisition. The leaders have to set the agenda. They've got to communicate the process up front, and they've got to stick to that process if they want to realise value. And a good example of this is, who remembers the old DHL Danzas brand? Anyone remember Danzas? My mum does. Who remembers just Danzas when they were in the early days? We've got one in the room. One of the things that one of the board members told me about the success of the Danzas acquisitions in DHL environment was this. When they made the drop dead date of the transaction, in other words, the day that the money was handed over, was the same day they hit the button on a 90-day plan for every employee that was affected by that acquisition. In other words, I would come along to manager and I would say, today is the day that we have just taken over this part of the business. I understand that that means uncertainty for you, so I'm going to give you some certainty. This is the certainty. The organisation will take the next 90 days to find a place for you in the business. If you are affected by this, so let's not try and waste 90 days, you are going to be affected. But we will take 90 days to work with you to find an alternative position. And if at the end of that 90 days we are unable to, this is what your exit looks like. This is the package, this is the number, this is the support component we'll give you to help you transition into a different role. I'm not saying we don't want you, but we want you to give you certainty of what the next 90 days is going to look like for you. We want to do that today, the day that we've handed over the money. And so although that might sound rather harsh, there's one thing that Manju walked away with. Absolute clarity about where she stood in the process. She knew that from day one. And so the rest of the 90 days became an easier journey than having to sit at her desk for 10 hours trying to put the same effort in that she was putting in prior to the merger, but with this thing of uncertainty in the back of her mind. And DHL will tell you that was the Danzas acquisitions were one of their most successful acquisitions in terms of realising value. Yet they had some challenges further down where they wanted to integrate their services, but from a people perspective, they retained the majority of their value within that transaction. So you've got to communicate up front. You've got to know that up front, you've got to have a crafted message. Who's heard the term stacking the deck? Anyone heard stacking the deck? It's a term that card players use if they want to influence the outcome. Right? Stack the deck. In other words, put all your best assets up front. There's 5 quick things you can do in that if you want to stack the deck in terms of the favourable outcome in terms of realising a deal. And they are conducting truth testing. There's no point in actually just taking things for gospel. To come back to your point, you don't know what you don't know. So ignorance and understanding the financials is not an excuse for why you got it wrong. You've got to get into the detail. You've got to start truth testing every piece of data that's available to you if you really want to understand where the value sits. You've got to mobilise your integration. That sits around planning. In other words, you've got to get that out there front and centre. You've got to have your roadshows. You've got to have your town hall meetings. You've got to communicate it. Don't wait till you've done the deal to do that. Talk about it in advance. You've got to identify the priorities on day one, much like the DHL Danzas story I mentioned. What are the priorities? What are the immediate things that we have to do on day one to ensure that we keep the watertight value that we've bought in the business? HR has to take a role prior to the purchase in actually analysing what they're buying from a people perspective, knowing where the gaps are in alignment, knowing where the overlays are. Where's the technology sit across that? All the things that Gopal talked about. Where's the alignment piece? There's no point in waiting till you bought the company, assuming there's some synergies. Right? We use that word way too often. There's some synergies in this acquisition. But there's no synergy in any acquisition until such time as you realise it. Everything else is just a hope. And you've got to constantly go through this review process of your integration. Every day, where are we at? What have we missed? Where are we at? What have we missed? What should we be looking for? What wasn't important today that actually now, is, because we're talking to people, has become a little more important in our agenda? How are we going to communicate that? Every day. So stacking the deck. You're going to stack the deck in your favour. So this button here is a little bit. Can we turn that side? Thank you. Just Can we just bring the slide back, please? This button's decided to die on me. Love technology there. There's a technology challenge. A couple more back, please. 2 more. Okay. So here's 5 key things you can do, and you should be doing. Don't wait to let the organisation or the person at their desk wonder about what their new boss is like. Right? It's the biggest fear employees have when they're acquired. Who are we going to work for? What are they like? Gee, I heard this market rumour. I saw them at a conference one. Oh, geez, I wasn't really impressed with them. That spreads like wildfire through the organisation. So before you execute, have the organisation chart, know the boxes. How many times do we go through and talk to organisations that have been going through a merger and you say, well, what does the structure look like at the end of it? Don't know, we're still working that out. But I've got an organisation chart. Yeah, that's great, but 90% of them have TBAs in it. People don't want to work for a TBA. They want to know who the next boss is. And they want the boss to come and sit there and say, if we're successful in closing this deal, this is my team. You're part of it. I want you on board. So tell me a bit about yourself. Take away the mystique of who the boss is going to be and do that up front. Most observers in any form of acquisition will talk to you about number 2, right? Most of them talk about the outside from a cultural perspective. Culture could not be more important in an acquisition, and it's got to be led from inside. Now, we have perceptions of what organisations are to work for, right? Virgin's a good example of that. Right? Everyone thinks that Virgin is a fantastic brand, full of energy, because that's what the marketing tells us. But actually, when you're in there, sure, there's that passion, but it's damn hard work, and it's very analytics-driven, very numbers-driven business. Outside, you don't necessarily see that. That's not what the external brand is. So it comes back to what Brenda was talking about this morning with our personality brands and what's the real culture inside an organisation. And as part of your due diligence, you should be understanding that alignment. And someone talked about culture earlier on. Understanding, therefore, where the gap is and how do we bridge that? Because we can't take the organisation completely to one end of the cultural alignment because we'll alienate all these people over here that have been in this lovely environment and retained in that, so they're obviously enjoying it. We can't go all that way because we'll lose. So you've got to find a space in the middle. I talked about this at the very start of the process, that HR is always an afterthought. It always comes at the end of it or towards the end of it, right? And then you hear these other lines when they come part of it. We won't do that right now. There's too much going on as part of the transformation that would just be too much risk. We'll upset the organisation so greatly that we'll lose everybody. Yes, we may lose some because we've merged the business, but if we do that change as well, we'll lose the whole lot. Let's park it, let's kick it down the road. So what happens is we buy the company undertakes an enormous shift and change, people get disrupted, those that are going to leave have left, we let them settle in, we bed it down, we start to get it right, our customers start to fall in love with us again, and then what do? We bring forward the piece that we kicked the can down the road on, and we start the transformation phase 2. We go through the same upheaval. So the myth that you have to be careful about how many disruptions you have isn't true. You've got to make the evaluated risk of actually what is the format if I run that concurrently during that process, and I take all my pain over a shorter period of time. Get on to that. I worked for an organisation many years ago that we were a major airline, and we couldn't get the Australia Post business. They just weren't going to take it off the national carrier, so we went and started a freight business. So that was good for a while, until we realised that actually all the air freight sat with the integrators, the courier companies, right? They were moving all these high-value parcels in the belly space of our planes. So what did? We went and started a courier company. So now we're an airline. The primary role in life is to move people. We've got a cargo business to try and fill the belly space because we couldn't get it from the market. We've got a freight company, and we've got this huge door-to-door fleet. That sort of stumbled on for about 15 years. Quite a successful courier business, actually. Until such point as the customers required the airlines and the courier companies to invest in technology, right? Real-time tracking. Someone talked about that this morning on one of the panels. And then all of a sudden now, we want to go and buy aircraft, And our courier company is saying we need a $20 million investment for track and trace and data in our vehicles. And I tell you which one's going to win, right? So we sold the courier company. And the company that bought it made a fundamental mistake. They said this, and this is where I'm going to do the aftershock now. They said, we also want to buy the brand rights for 2 years. Because we think if we suddenly take this courier company and put it in our colours, we will lose all the customers. Right? They love you so much, they've chosen to use you, they didn't choose to use us, so we want to keep the brands running parallel. But we'll put all the same vehicles in the same shed, so one vehicle will be blue and the other will be orange. We'll keep the sales team separate for 2 years, and then we'll slowly integrate the brands, so our customers won't even notice. So for 2 years they paid us a licensing fee to use the brand name, which was pretty good from where we sat on the acquisition team. We didn't expect that. What do you think happened in 2 years? Anybody? What do you think happened after 2 years when we suddenly said you can't use the brand anymore? They lost the same customers they were going to lose on day one. All they did was kick the pain down the road for 2 years and have constant disruptions, because every time the parcel moved, the company made effort, or the customers who didn't like the orange company made sure the company didn't know about it. And the moment they changed the brand, the same customers that were identified as being at risk were the same ones that walked out the door. The moral of the story there is they were going to have that pain anyway, but they caused themselves 2 years of disruptions trying to run things separately in a smoke and mirrors environment. 2 years of the sales team competing against each other for deals and discounting the product. And so the yields of both companies went down as a result. And ultimately they lost the same customers as they identified the risk. The reverse profile of Vista. So it's a myth that you have to defer your shocks or your transformations. If you're going to make a big transformation, think about how to actually roll that all into one and get it out of the way. Take the pain down. Oscar would be the best guy to talk to about this, because we're both in the similar businesses, right? But there is a real art and a science to selecting your executives. Don't leave it to chance during the merger. Take some time to work with the outside parties who are specialists. Work with your HR teams. Use the tools, the psychometric testing. Build the best team you can with the talent you have available in the two organisations. It doesn't happen by chance. There is an art and a science to it, as Oscar and I will contest to every day of the week when we talk about hiring people. And we don't always get it right. There is a definite art and science to it. And lastly, it's about preparation for your executive leadership team. Your leadership teams are going to be the ones that are walking into the depots, into the customer service areas, and explaining to them where the benefits are and why this is a good thing for the investors, why it's a good thing for the staff. And yet often we don't bring that next level of management team into the acquisition process until right at the very end. And so the readiness isn't actually there. Can we just flick the slide over, please? Thank you. Lastly, there will be aftershocks. How many people were like me in March 2012 and went through the Japanese tsunami earthquake? Anybody? Anybody else? I can tell you, we spent 24 hours in the lobby of a hotel, and every time the building shook, it felt like the first earthquake. There will be aftershocks. They are predictable. You don't have one big earthquake and the whole thing stops and that was fun. No, they carry on and they diminish over time. The same applies to any merger and acquisition. You'll never get it perfect. There will be aftershocks. There'll be things that surprise you. But you can do 6 critical things. And the guys at Deloitte's hone this with. Get your leadership alignment right. Make sure you're putting the right leaders in the right place. Design your organisation up front. Make sure you've got that design aligned to your customers' desires and to your business capabilities. Talent retention. Know where your talent sits in the organisation and how to keep it. I worked in Saudi Arabia with an airline where we privatised the cargo business, or a big chunk of it. And I was involved in the actual deal. I came in as an afterpiece of it. And one of the pieces of paper I got, I was flicking through, and it literally said this: you have a 4-week window to which to jettison, that's the word they use, jettison anybody in the business who you don't want to keep back to the airline. So in other words, you can buy the business, you can cherry pick the talent, but you've got 4 weeks. What do you think happened after week 2? The chairman of the airline rang up and said, guys, that's enough. You can't send everybody back. You won't have a business. So get your talent retention strategies right. Know the ones you're going to let go of and redeploy. Know the skill sets that are in the right area in the business and you want to keep. The skills that are in the wrong area of the business but be deployed elsewhere to actually better position them. And do that during that integration process. Cultural alignment, I touched on that. Very important. And last but not least, day one. What's going to happen day one? What does it look like? Where's the fallout going to be? What are the messages we're going to communicate? Are our people on board with that? Do we have the capability to deal with day one? I worked for a US cabling company that bought a very large piece of business in China. They bought a factory that made car cabling. And I sat at the deal evaluation team, so we went through it over a period of a year and we identified a range of targets in China which we wanted to buy for the domestic market. And our job was to go and look at the people part of that business and work out where the skeletons were. And we looked at 7 deals, 7 organisations. One was a Sino-Trans business, and the rest were all promoter-led businesses. Of those 7 deals, there was one that was quite inviting and appetite, so the company bought it. And they threw the team out from the Americans, and we've been working with some people who are closer to this part of the world and understood the cultural issues of dealing with Asia. But the actual deal day was led by the American team. So what do you think they did on day one when they turned up to the factory at 7 a.m? They locked the gates. And they had a security guard there who went and shut the gates, locked the door, so as employees start to turn up for work for their shifts, mostly blue collar. Right? They started to hand out little letters to say overnight your organisation's been bought and you're all terminated. But come back tomorrow and we'll interview for a job. That was honest. Now, most of us sat in the room in Shanghai the night before we were told that's what's going to happen. So this team arrives in, great, well done, you've got the deal, you've signed it over, we buy it tomorrow, we take over. Now let's talk about the takeover plan. So, shouldn't we talk about actually the messages? No, we're going to go up there, we're going to close the gates, and we're going to tell them all to go away for the day, but they can come back tomorrow, we'll interview them, we'll pick the ones we want to keep. That doesn't work in China. What do you think happened? That's right, they busted the fence down, destroyed about $2 million worth of property. Right? Why? Because as far as they were concerned, the promoter who had run off with the money, they weren't going to get any of it. Little did they know that we were already factored into it, because the rashness of the cultural alignment was so different that the Americans couldn't see the benefit of that. They didn't understand that actually we don't quite do that in Asia that way. There will be consequences. Funny enough, they repeated the same thing in India just recently, so some organisations don't do it. Okay, so look, that's it from there. A little bit over 20 minutes, the window. We've got lunch coming up in a few minutes' time. We've got about 5 minutes for Q&A. Any questions? Anything you'd like to know? No? No wisdom? Great. Oh, Heather.
I've unfortunately been through several mergers and acquisitions, and one of the things that seems to me that all these plans can be well thought out, but you never know who's going to choose to leave on their own. And as the cultural morale begins to erode as the company, your best people leave, and you're left with who you're left with.
Yeah.
And I feel as though, yeah, so when I was saying,
Yeah,
this
you're
is
right.
on that the voluntary attrition is a huge part of organizational change that is not really thought out. Like you talk about who's going to get packages, but are those people really going to stay? And so what's the backup plan when your good people do leave? You can say these are on keeping, but it's not a dictatorship that people are free to go. And understanding about getting the culture right so everyone would like to stay, but still what's the plan B when people hate change and most of your good people will leave over this?
And I'll be honest with you, of the 8 or 9 deals we sit on every year, very seldom do organisations think about a plan B for their organisation chart if the key people walk out. I've even been part of one where the key executives left and set up a competitive organisation. So you are right. I mean, never take for granted that you're actually going to retain your best people, right? Never take that for granted. Which is also why bringing forward that communication piece and engagement early during the adoption phase is actually much more important than giving them the shock up front. Let them be part of that process. Bring them in and let them help them shape that organisation and let them see that there's a place for them. But once again, you're never guaranteed. And yeah, that's human nature, unfortunately. Any other questions? No? Good. Well, thank you very much. We're going to break for lunch now. There are a couple of people in the room that have been through this, so if you want to talk about M&As and some ideas about it, there's a half dozen heads and hands that have been through it. I see Brian Worry in the back there, and I know he's been through a few. I'm sure that there's some experts in the room to help lend some attention. So thank you very much. Really appreciate your attention, and we'll see you back here, Oscar, in about an hour. Is that right? What time are we?
1:45.
1:45. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate you doing it.